Our first lesson is not from the scriptures, and it's called The God Who Only Knows 4 Words. And I'm going to share what Brenda sent to me regarding this poem. And I hope I pronounce this name right when I'm reading here. Hafiz is the pen name to the Persian Sufi poet Shams ad-Din Muhammad Hafez, who lived from about 1325 to 1390 in what we now call modern-day Iran. Hafez is a name given to those who memorize the Quran. His collected works are regarded by modern Iranians as a pinnacle of Persian literature, and he perhaps influenced Persian writing more than any other native Persian author. His poem captures the mystic's journey to a union with God. Every child has known God, not the God of names, not the God of don'ts, not the God who ever does anything weird, but the God who knows only 4 words and keeps repeating them, saying, "Come dance with me, come dance." Our second lesson is from the Gospel of John. For those of us who read The Church of the Wild, the author, Victoria Lures, writes in her chapter titled Logos about the translation of that word. Its translation, in the translation I'll be reading, logos is translated word, but it could also be translated conversation. As I read, you may want to try to change the word to conversation and think about the difference that makes. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us.
A few years ago, I ran across a video in which the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson answered a question that had been posed to him. The question was, what is the most astounding fact that you can share with us about the universe? And Dr. Tyson thought for a moment, and then he said this: the most astounding fact is the knowledge that the atoms that comprise life on Earth, the atoms that make up the human body, are traceable to the stars that collapsed and exploded, scattering their enriched guts across the galaxy. Guts made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and all the fundamental ingredients of life itself. He reflected that, yes, we are part of the universe, but the universe is also in us. Because our atoms came from stars, we are connected to the universe just by being alive. Astounding, indeed, isn't it? That we are made of star stuff, and we are connected intimately, not only with our family members and our communities, but with the entire universe. At about the same time, I saw a TED Talk by Dr. Suzanne Simard, a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, whom some of you might know was the inspiration for one of the scientists in the novel The Overstory by Richard Powers, which was an all-church read a couple of summers ago. She is also the author of the recent book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. Dr. Simard's TED Talk was also astounding for me. It was about how she discovered through experimentation that trees communicate through the underground fungal network that they all share in the forest floor. Not only were the trees communicating, but they were also sharing resources. When one tree was in too much shade and needed more carbon, the other type of tree would send the carbon to the tree in need. More recently, Samard has discovered that a large dying tree, an ancient tree that's ready to give up its life, transmits about 40% of the carbon stored in the tree through networks into their neighboring trees. In this way, these old trees are actually having a very direct effect on the regenerative capacity of the new forest going forward. Now, it's a bit tempting to anthropomorphize the tree, and we shouldn't do that, but I can't help but think how those trees are connected to each other, and that connection is important to the ecosystem. And because we're connected through those atoms of oxygen and nitrogen and carbon that we share, our connection with the trees is also vitally important. The trees are talking to each other. Why aren't we talking with the trees? This great conversation of the universe, this connection that we share with the natural world and with each other, is one of the subjects of Victoria Lors's book, Church of the Wild. I know that many of you have read this work now as part of our most recent all-church read, but some of you may not have. And this idea of us all being connected and in conversation with each other is so important. At least it's important to me, that I wanted as many people in our community to learn about it. So I apologize to those of you who have read and digested the book that this might be a little repetitive. But I hope that by talking about it and starting this conversation, that we can all come to a common understanding and begin that conversation ourselves. In her book, Lors talks not so much about the trees talking to each other, but about all the natural world speaking all the time, and that we have, as she says, forgotten the capacity to understand the voices and to speak with them, ask their advice, and seek their wisdom. She quotes the Catholic priest and philosopher Thomas Berry, lamenting the losses that we suffer due to our separation from nature's conversation. We are talking to ourselves, Berry writes. We are not talking to the rivers. We are not listening to the wind and the stars. We have broken the great conversation. Lours talks about her experience encountering deer in the Colorado mountains and says, "The does that I met in the Colorado mountains did not learn English, and I did not learn mule deer. But as we sat together in the rain, I felt welcomed back into a conversation I didn't even realize that I was missing. They regarded me with an equality of being that humbled me." Thomas Berry suggested that restoring the conversation with river and deer and trees can actually repair the world. I don't think he was talking metaphorically, she says, at least not completely. I think he was speaking to the inherent capacity we as beings on earth have to actually engage in a conversation deeper than words, one which is going on all the time. And that conversation is what actually holds the web of life together. Hear that again. That conversation is what actually holds the web of life together. Lours continues to say that conversation is a vehicle, the artery of connection, whether with a friend or with a field of clover. Somewhere in the conversation, the content is almost not important anymore. The exchange itself creates and deepens relationship. Repairing the great conversation means that we approach the world as alive, respecting that every individual, every single human, every single leaf, every single ant is unique and has their own subjective reality. When we invest time and attention in connecting with others as sacred, as Thomas Berry said, we become sacred. It's almost as if the connection between the conversation itself is how the sacred is manifested. The idea that there is a sacredness at the center of all things, a sacredness at the center of the universe, with every unique part in conversation with the others, is not a unique idea. Many philosophers have talked about this idea, and many faith traditions believe it is so. The ancient ancestors of Christianity called this sacred indwelling the Logos. One of my favorite passages of the Gospel according to John is the very beginning of it, which is both a creation story and a birth story, although it's a different birth story from the nativity narratives in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. For years, I had never questioned the translation of this passage. I understood that the Greek word logos was the same as the English equivalent word. Let's see, I think that's my next slide. Is it? No. We'll go back. It's coming up. But this isn't so. As Laura's notes in her book, logos is not really properly translated as word. Laura's relates how her mind exploded and her worldview exploded and her heart exploded when she began to study the history of the Greek word logos and how it really should be translated. And as I read her book, my mind exploded as well. As Laura's notes, she discovered that logos has a profound meaning that has been buried beneath a long history of patriarchy and mistranslation and empire. This word has the potential to completely reframe how we understand our interactions with spirit, nature, and ourselves. And as you all know, I am always interested in unburying words and meanings from the clutches of patriarchy. As Lours dug into the history of the Greek word logos, she discovered that ancient Greek philosophers used the word cosmologically to articulate a kind of intelligent life force embedded in and interconnecting to all things. Logos is the principle or power that shapes and creates all things, immanent and embedded in all that exists. Logos is the relationship between all things, holding them together. Logos is a process of dialogue. Furthermore, logos also held an explicit sense that everything in nature is full of some kind of divine indwelling, worthy of reverence. Logos is similar to what biologists like Suzanne Simard are discovering about the way trees talk to one another, and what quantum scientists have discovered at the center of molecules, not things, but relationships. Logos is about the divine relationship between all things. The system of their connection is conversation. As with any word, with this sort of complex meaning, often a single English term is not enough to capture the nuance of such complexity. Translating logos as word just simply doesn't communicate the breadth and meaning of the concept. One thing to remember about translation, especially of the Gospels, is that they were originally written in Greek and were then translated into Latin, which quickly became the common language of the early church. And our English translations of the Bible rely both on the early Greek manuscript fragments that we have, but also the early Latin translations. In Latin, logos is rendered as verbum, which is where we get the word in English. Okay, verbum is word, kind of a single act of speech. But for the first few centuries of Christianity, the early bishops and theologians of the church translated the Greek logos into Latin not as verbum, but as sermo. If you read the early Greek or the early church theologians in their tracts, their reflections on the gospel, when they refer to this passage, they write it as sermo, not verbum. Rather than a single word, sermo means conversation. Sermo more closely approaches the complex concepts contained in the word logos. In the beginning was the conversation. Listen to the whole passage from John that Liz read this time with the word conversation inserted. In the beginning was the conversation. And the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. This was with God in the beginning. All things came into being through this, and apart from this, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in this was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. And the conversation became flesh and dwelt among us. It wasn't until the beginning of the 5th century, with the influence of St. Augustine, yet another reason to be bothered by St. Augustine, that the Latin translations began to stop using sermo for logos. What would have happened if the church had continued to use the word sermo to refer to the Christ? What would have happened if Christianity had continued to understand the relationship of God and humanity through Christ as a conversation rather than a one-way moment of speech? We can only imagine. But we can, if we wish, begin to use this idea in our own theology and devotional practice, and in how we see ourselves interacting with the sacred in the world and the sacred that is in every living being on the planet, human or otherwise. What if, knowing that the holy is indwelling in everything, we begin to have conversations with the trees, with the rivers, with the wind and the stars? What if those sacred conversations lead us to deeper conversations with both human and non-human fellow beings, and with God? Friends, God is still speaking, inviting us into conversation with all that is sacred, with all that holds the web of life together. I would pray that we will listen and join in and hear the divine whispering to us, as the poet Hafiz did. Come dance with me. Come dance. Amen.